In this video, I'd like to show you how you can use our Laravel multi-tenancy package. After demonstrating what the package does, we'll also dive into the code. There are approaches where you use a single database, and there are approaches where you use a database per tenant of your application. Some applications require a separate cache per tenant. In other applications, a separate file system is required. The package tries to tackle these problems by not being specific, hence the word unopinionated in our tagline. Instead of trying to provide code for each and every case, the package tries to make it easy to create tasks that should be executed when a tenant becomes the current one. But before diving into that, let's review a small demo application that I've created. I've already pre-installed Laravel multi-tenancy in this project, and I'm going to demonstrate a multi-database setup. So each tenant will have its own database. The package assumes that you'll have multiple database connections. So we have a tenant connection for all tenants. And you can see that the database name for this connection is set to null. When the current tenant is determined, we are going to set this config file dynamically to the database of the tenant. This will become more clear when you see it in action. If we scroll down, then we have another connection, the landlord connection. And this connection is being used for all non-tenant specific things. And also the tenant table itself probably will live on the landlord database. That also will become clear with an example. I've already created 3 databases. One for the landlord and then 2 databases for the 2 tenants. The tenants are defined in the tenant table on the landlord connection. So we have here tenant 1 test and tenant 2 test. When there is a request coming in for the tenant 1 domain, we are going to fill that database config value with what is in this attribute. And if there's a request coming in for tenant 2.test, we are going to use this database name in the config file. Locally, I'm using Valet. And in Valet, you can route extra domains to an application with a link command. So I can execute valid link tenant1 and .test is assumed to map that domain to this application, and I'll do the same for tenant2. Before heading into the browser, let's take a look at the multi-tenancy config file. The first thing that you can specify here is the tenant finder. And this is how you can instruct the package on how to find a certain tenant for a certain request. And I've used domain tenant finder here, which is a tenant finder that ships with the package. If we take a look at the code, you can see that it is very easy. We are just going to get the host of the request, and then we simply use the tenant model to find the first tenant that has that host as its domain. And this domain tenant finder will get executed early on in the request in a service provider. Let's head back to the config file. And if I scroll a little bit down, then we have tasks that can be executed when a tenant is made the current one. So if the tenant finder finds a tenant, then these tasks will be executed. And by default, the package specifies no tasks here, because you yourself should define what should happen when a tenant is being made the current one. Even though there are no tasks here set by default, they serve as inspiration for creating your own tasks. Let's take a look at the switch tenant database task. When a tenant is being made the current one, the make current function is being called, and it receives the tenant that should be made the current one. And we'll execute this function, set tenant connection database name, and we give it the database name of the tenant. And this function is just reading that database attribute. So if I go back to table plus, it is this value here. Let's head back and take a look at this function. And here we first try to determine what a database connection name to the tenant is. And most usually this will be the string tenant. We will check if such a connection is defined. And if it is, we are going to change the database property with the database name that was given. And finally, we are going to purge the current database connection for that connection name. So Laravel will use the updated config when executing queries. Let's see that in action. In the route file, we have this welcome view. And I've slightly modified this welcome view. If I scroll a little bit down, you'll see it. So instead of displaying Laravel, I'm going to display the current tenant name. And the name of a tenant is also defined in the database. So let's head to the browser and visit tenant1.test. I'm going to refresh here. And here you can see that tenant1 is the active one. If I go to tenant2, then we should see the second tenant, and we do. Now let's register a user here. So I'm going to register myself. So Freek at spatie.be. I'm going to use a random password and I'm going to register. And I'm logged in. Now I'm using the second tenant here. So if I go to the database, then I should see a user for the second tenant, but not for the first tenant. So we've successfully verified that we use the right database here. The package can also make queue jobs tenant aware. Let's go to the multi-tenancy config file and scroll a bit down. Here you can see the option that defines if queue should be tenant aware by default. Now, what is a tenant aware queue? For web requests, we can use the request to determine which tenant should be active. But for queue jobs, which have no request, we can't do this. The package can solve this problem in a neat way. Whenever a job is dispatched, while there is a tenant active, then the package will make sure that when that job is being handled, that tenant will be made the current one behind the scenes. Let me prove this to you. I'm going to add something to this welcome route. I'm going to dispatch a job, and I've already prepared the job, test job. So new test job. And let's take a look at test job. So test job is a regular job. It just implements should queue. And here we are going to get the current tenant, and we are going to log the tenant name, and we're also going to log which database is being used. So let's dispatch this job. And again, that test job is dispatched whenever I see the welcome view. So I'm going to start Horizon here. And I'm also going to tail the log. Let's now go back to that welcome view, and I'm going to hit the welcome view of the second tenant. And let's see what's being written in the log. And here you can see that inside of the job, tenant2 was made the current one, and we're using this database. Let's try it again for the first tenant. So tenant1.test, head back to PHP Storm, and you can see that inside that job, tenant1 was the current one. So that is a short demo of what the package can do for you. So summarized, the package can determine which tenant should be the current one, and you can easily define what should be done to make a tenant the current one. And in this case, we simply switch the database name of the tenant connection. Before source diving the package itself, I'd like to show you one more thing, and that is how we handle migrations. So let me close up this terminal and also close this one. And let's take a look at the migrations directory. And you can see here that we have a couple of migrations inside of the migrations directory directly, but we also have a subdirectory called landlord. You can name this directory anything that you like, but I think landlord is a good name. Here you'll put all migrations that should not happen in the tenant database, but for the database, which we call the landlord database, that has all non-tenant specific info. Now, how do you perform migrations of the landlord database? Well, you simply give the migration command the path to those migrations and the name of the connection. And Laravel didn't name the option just right. It says here database, but it's actually the connection name. But of course, everything is migrated already. In my application, I already had this tenant database. Now you know how the landlord database can migrate it. Let's take a look at how we can migrate the tenant databases. We can't use the regular migrate command because the migrate command will only perform these migrations for one database. We need a way to perform the migrate command for all tenants. To solve this, the package ships with a tenant artisan command. And what tenant artisan will do is it will loop through all the tenants, make each of one active, and for each of those tenants, it will perform the artisan command that you give it. So here we are going to run the migrate fresh command for all tenants. Let's see that in action. So here you can see some output regarding the looping. This is the output of the migrate command itself. And next up, we do the same for the second tenant. This is quite nice because tenants artisan can make any existing artisan command tenant aware. I think this quick demo gives you a good feeling of what the package can do. If you want to know more about how you can use the package, head over to the documentation site. Everything the package can do is clearly explained there. Now that you have a basic understanding of what the package can do, let's dive into its source. So I'm going to PHP Storm and to the source code of the package itself. You're now looking at the multi-tenancy service provider, which of course gets executed whenever Laravel starts. So first up, we are going to execute register publishables. And like you probably know by now, this takes care of letting Laravel know what should be done when executing the vendor publish command. So we are going to publish the config file of the package to the config path in the Laravel application. And we're going to do more or less the same for the migration. You probably also have seen this one before, boot commands. And here we're simply going to register that tenants artisan command that you just saw. Next up, we are going to register the tenant finder. Let's take a look at that one. So if there is a tenant finder registered in the multi-tenancy config file, we are going to bind it in the container. And this tenant finder class, it is the abstract class where every tenant finder extends from. We'll use this binding later on. So what is next? Register tasks collection. Here we are going to take a look at which tenant tasks are defined in the config file and also bind that in the container. We're even binding it as a singleton so that this only happens exactly once. I'll shed some more light on that later on. Let's see what happens next. Let's take a look at configure requests. So in configure requests, if we're not running in the console, we are going to execute determine current tenant. And if there is a current tenant defined in the config file, we are going to resolve it from the container, and we are going to call the only method that is required on a tenant finder, namely find for request. So if we take a look at that tenant finder, you can see that we give it the request and maybe we get back a tenant. And let's take a look at the only class that we ship by default that extends the tenant finder, and that is that domain tenant finder you saw in the demo earlier. If you take a look at the project structure, you can see that it is the only one here. If you need to find tenants in some other way, just define your own tenant finder by extending the base class and registering that one in the config file. Let's head back to the service provider. So here, if we find a tenant, we are going to make it the current one. And let's take a look at what happens there. So in tenant, we are going to execute this function. In this piece of code, we are going to take a look at which action class is defined in the make tenant current action key of the multi-tenancy config file. Let's take a look at the config file, so multi-tenancy, and if I scroll a little bit down, you can see the actions here. And this is the one we're trying to find now, make tenant current action. This has been set up this way that if you want to change something on the make tenant current action process, you can easily do so. You just have to create a class that extends from the default action, but in most cases, the default action will be enough. So let's take a look at what this action does. When constructing the action, we get that task collection that we defined earlier. And to be clear, that task collection, that is basically a class that wraps around the tasks that are defined in the config file. So in the previous demo, we had that switch tenant database task here. Let's head back to the action. So when this action gets executed, we are going to fire off an event, making tenant current event, so other parts of your application can hook into this too. And next up, we are going to perform all these tasks to make the tenant current. And here we are going to loop over each item in that task collection, and all those tasks implement switch tenant task. And we are going to call make current on that task. Let's take a look at that switch tenant task interface. So it's very simple. It has a function that will be executed when making the tenant current. And we also have a function that will be called when forgetting the current tenant. I don't think you'll need this often, but I can imagine scenarios where it's handy to forget the current tenant. Now let's take a look at an implementation of this interface. So of course we've already seen that switch database tenant task, and I already explained it to you. Whenever we call make current of this task, we are going to set the database name of the tenant connection to the database name of the tenant. So we are going to dynamically change a config value. But there's one other task as well, prefix cache task. And I'm not going into details on what this task does, but I want to highlight the implementation of forget current. So what the package essentially does is it will change the prefix of the cache. And in forget current, so when we are going to forget the current tenant, we should change the cache prefix to the one that was used before making a tenant active. And here you can see that original prefix. Now that original prefix is being set in the constructor. And remember that I said that the task collection is being bound as a singleton? Well, that is very handy here, because all of the tasks in a task collection will also only be constructed once. So when the constructor is executed, we are going to save that original prefix, so it can be used here. And because this is only being done when Laravel itself boots, we have that original prefix always available. So when making a tenant the current one, we will make the cache tenant specific, and when forgetting the current tenant, we will set it back to what it was when Laravel booted. That's how that works. Now let's head back to our action. So to refresh, we are here, perform tasks to make tenant current. And that's basically looping over all tasks in the task collection. And next up, we are going to bind the tenant as the current one. And let's take a look at the implementation. So in the config file, you can specify a string that will be used to bind the tenant in the container. We are going to forget the previous instance, and we are going to set the given tenant in the container like this using that container key. Now, why do we do this? Well, let's go to the tenant model. If we go to the static current function here, then you can see when this function is being executed, we simply use that container key and check if it is set. And if it is set, we are going to return it. So this function will return the current tenant if it has been set. Let's go back to our action. And you can see that making a tenant the active one is actually quite simple. It's simply looping through those tasks and binding that tenant in the container. And by making it very easy to allow users to define tasks of their own that should be executed when making a tenant the current one, the package is very flexible. Next, let's take a look at how we can make jobs tenant aware. Let's head back to our multi-tenancy service provider and scroll a little bit up to the boot function. So I've explained what configure request does. It just determines the current tenant, and if there is one found, it will be made the current one. And after configuring the requests, we are going to configure the queue. So in configure queue, we are going to call make queue tenant aware action. And that action contains all logic that is needed to make queues tenant aware. So if a tenant is the current one when a job gets dispatched, that tenant will be made the current one when handling that job. All of that behavior is being done here. Implementing this falls in two parts. We are going to do something when jobs are being queued, and we are going to do when the jobs are being processed. Let's take a look at lesson24 jobs being queued first. So here we are going to give a callable to the createPayloadUsing method of Laravel's queue. Simply said, we are going to say to Laravel, hey, whenever you dispatch a job, also do this. Here we are going to reach in the job being created, and if it is tenant aware, and this function will return true in most circumstances when this config option is set to true. Queues are tenant aware by default. There's a little bit more to it, but I don't want to dive into that now. So imagine this returns true. Then, if there is a current tenant, add a tenant ID key to the payload of this job and let that key contain the ID of the current tenant. So this is being done when jobs are being queued. Let's take a look at what happens when a job is being processed. Whenever Laravel will start processing a job, it will fire off an event job processing. Here we will check if the payload contains a tenant ID that we just set, and if we find a tenant for that ID, we'll make that tenant current. And this is all that it's needed to make queues tenant aware. I'd like to give Mohamed Said credits for this. I basically copied what he showed in his videos on multi-tenancy. And actually a lot of things in this package are inspired by the code he shared there. Now that you know what happens when making a tenant the current one and how we make queues tenant aware, let's take a look at that tenants artisan command. So this is the command that I showed you earlier that can make any existing artisan command tenant aware. Earlier in this video, we used this command to migrate the database of each tenant. So this command accepts an artisan command, and optionally you can give it an array of tenants. And by default will loop over all tenants, but if you gave us some tenant IDs, we'll only loop over those tenants. And here the looping itself is being done. We use the cursor method here for performance reasons. It will be much more performant than get when there are a lot of tenants. In the loop itself, we are going to call run artisan command for tenant, and we give it the tenant we're looping over and the artisan command that you gave us. And in run artisan command, we simply are going to output some text so that you know which tenant is being handled. We are going to make the given tenant the current one. So we are going to run through all the tasks defined and we are going to bind the current tenant in the container. And then we simply are going to call the command that you gave us. It's really a very straightforward approach, and I'd like to give some credits to my colleague Sebastian who came up with this idea. That is all I got for now on this multi-tenancy package. If you want to know more, head over to the documentation. There are lots of interesting tidbits to discover, and if you want to know more about how it works, I can also recommend you to read the test suite.